Good afternoon. This is the fifth annual conference of the Race, Inequality, and Language in Education program at Stanford University. This year, we're focusing on pursuing educational equity in uncertain times. And here to welcome you to this year's conference is the James Quillen Dean of the Graduate School of Education, Dean Daniel Swartz.
Thank you, Arnitha. Welcome everyone to the 2020 RILE conference. This is going to be an amazing conference. The speakers and the structure of the conference are brilliant, and the conference itself is extremely important. So right now, I imagine about 60% of the US population is directly impacted by school closures. This would be the children and their parents, and in many cases, the grandparents. But to me, it's stunning that none of the presidential candidates has really spoken to education. I think this is the case. We're in California, which means we don't hear much from the presidential candidates because they all know how California is going to vote. But I sure haven't heard anything. And in the meantime, you know, the awakening to structural racism and Black Lives Matters has caught the nation's attention. Yet again, I don't hear about the role of education and racism being noted in the media. So these are bad things. On the positive side, I am seeing a shift in public sentiment, including philanthropy, as about all 60% of these people begin to experience what a lack of educational access and opportunity means and how unevenly it is and has been distributed. So the RILE conference is important because the appetite for research and insights is growing, and we want to be prepared with state-of-the-art knowledge and solutions. So when the foundational role of education, and by foundational, I mean educating people, not just letting people go back to work, when it finally bursts on the scene, we'll be there with the knowledge and the insights and the solutions to help guide people forward. So thank you, and thank goodness for the RILE conference. It's very important. Before I finish my welcome, I want to give a final shout out to Professor Arnitha Ball. So actually, it is not a final shout out because she's going to receive the Roland Volunteer Service Prize at Stanford on Wednesday. And I'll be speaking about her 7 books, AERA presidencies, and many, many other things. But for those of you who know Arnitha, she actually has retired. This will be the last RILE conference that is her central responsibility. And I just want to acknowledge, as I do for every conference, but once and for all, that Arnitha is the greatest convener of all time. She knows how to put on a conference, and I suspect if she throws parties, they're really good too. So thank you, Arnitha. And Brian Brown, I want to thank you for stepping up to lead the RILE program forward. And thank you everyone for attending. Best wishes.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Brian, as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our RILE graduate student host for today's seminar. It's David Song. David Song is a 6th-year doctoral student in the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. He was born in Wuhan, China, and has a master's degree in economic policy from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is currently writing his dissertation on educational equity and Mandarin language education. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Professor Ball. I'm especially pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Linda Darling-Hammond, as well as Professors Maria Ledesma and Francis Pearman, who will be on the panel with her. Professor Linda Darling-Hammond is the Charles E. Duhamel Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University, and her research has contributed extensively to education policy and teacher education. Dr. Francis Pearman is Assistant Professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, whose work focuses on poverty, race, and American cities. Dr. Maria Ledesma is a professor at San Jose State University, whose work focuses on race, education, policy, and higher ed. Our theme today is race, policy, and reform in a post-COVID society. As we well know, the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced virtually every element of our society, and schooling and racial disparities, as Dean Schwartz has said, are no exception. The overwhelming majority of young people who have died to the pandemic are Black, Indigenous, or Latinx, while we continue to witness an alarming variety of responses to the pandemic from school districts and universities. Professor Darling-Hammond will deliver the keynote titled Policy and School Practice in the COVID World. And afterwards, she will be joined by Professors Pearman and Ledesma for a panel discussion about education policy during these times, defined both by pandemic and ongoing systemic racism. Thank you.
And I wonder if that's my cue to begin. Is it? All right.
Yes,
First,
Linda, it is.
All right.
Thank you.
First, I want to acknowledge Arnitha and all the folks that are involved in throwing this conference for RILE. Arnitha sits in the chair that I used to sit in, the Charles E. Ducommon chair. We have been working on these issues for a very long time, and she has, as Dan said, really carried this agenda forward in a remarkable way. And then I know that there is a village that was involved in putting this conference together, and I want to recognize all the people in the village. I am going to share my screen and see if we can get the technology to work here. There we go. And I'm going to speak to this issue of policy and practice in a post-COVID world, the issues of educational equity in uncertain times from the perspective of the research that I've been doing over many years, currently at the Learning Policy Institute, which exists to carry evidence into the policy arena, and also in my role as president of the State Board of Education in California, where the effects of the pandemic are obvious and in need of attention every single day. I am going to start by just noting that this is not only a public health crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. We have a huge decline in state revenues, and we have many, many people losing their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods. It's a civil rights crisis, appropriately raising the issues that have surfaced because of the taking of Black lives by policemen and in many, many, many contexts. And these are issues that have been around for a long time, but they're coming to the surface. And all of these issues manifest in ways that reflect the results of generations of systemic racism. Our current realities include yawning equity chasms that threaten major segments of society, and that, of course, draw attention to the ways in which racism is embedded in all of the systems and institutions in our society. We have the largest economic disparities since 1929, right before the crash that then led to the Great Depression. We've seen inadequate action federally to address the health, safety, and economic effects of the pandemic. And we've also seen schools as one of the few safety nets in many hard-hit communities. And in fact, when schools were closed in March in California, the first thing that they mobilized to do, that systems mobilized to do, was to provide meals, not only for the children who were signed up for free and reduced price lunches, but also for all of the children in many schools and their families, because, and not only for the school days, but for the weekends, because so many people in the state rely on the school meals to get through the week. The many aspects of the safety net also have included outreach around the digital divide, outreach around health and mental health care. So schools have been really at the hub of the survival system for a lot of families. Today in the United States, the wealthiest 1% of people hold 10 times more wealth than the bottom 50% of people. And as you can see, that disparity has been growing. This shows since the 1990s, and the disparities began to grow even before then. The US has the highest child poverty rate in the industrialized world by a long shot, and beyond the fact that there are about 1 in 4 children living in poverty, we have a growing number of young people in severe poverty, way below the poverty line. We have growing homelessness, food insecurity, healthcare insecurity, and a tattered safety net because we don't have in place the social policies that many other countries have in place. If you add to this the fact that school funding is unequal in the United States, it is unequal across states, with the highest spending states spending 3 times more than the lowest spending states. It's also unequal within states. And this shows New York and California. A couple of years ago, California has since enacted a more progressive school funding policy. New York has not. More than 30 states have regressive spending policies that spend more on the children of the wealthy than on the children of the poor. And poverty is increasingly concentrated in specific districts and schools, which are also increasingly segregated. Only 12 states spend at least 10% more in those high poverty districts. And so what we see is a growing number of what you might think of as apartheid schools, which are 90% plus, usually African-American and Latinx students, with almost every student in the school living in poverty. This is a result of policies that have happened over the last 30 years. In fact, in the 1960s, we actually closed the child poverty levels by more than half, and the Black-White achievement gap closed by more than half over the course of a couple of decades. And almost all the policies that allowed for that, which include desegregation policies, school finance reform policies, were eliminated in the 1980s. And so the achievement gap is now 30% greater than it was 30 years ago. In addition to those dismantling of policies, funding levels for education have been falling for a decade. After the Great Recession in 2008, about half the states had not even returned to that level of funding a decade later, before this, which will be a much greater recession or depression, took place, and major federal aid programs have also shrunk, so that we have really schools that serve low-income children hardest hit, even while they have greater needs to address. So the effects of inequality are rampant in our society, and the one place that has the positioning to step up and address much of this, the school system, has not been supported to be able to carry out this task. If you think about the anatomy of inequality, it begins with the level of poverty and segregation that I've described, on which we layer unequal school resources. That produces an inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators. It is those schools that serve the greatest proportions of students of color that are 4, 5, 6 times more likely, depending on the state, to have teachers who are untrained, who are inexperienced, and to cycle in and out like a revolving door. That inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators then produces a number of other side effects. That produces the side effect of having an inadequate understanding of learning and development of pedagogy, which leads to poorly organized instruction. Often that's focused on very low-level skills and sort of memorizing and spitting back facts, rather than learning to conceptualize and analyze and develop higher order thinking skills. It leads to teachers having very few tools to scaffold learning or to respond to student needs. It leads to exclusionary discipline, which we know is also discriminatory in the way that it's applied in many, many schools, with particularly African-American students and students with disabilities being excluded at much higher rates, often for very minor behaviors that would be treated differently in other settings. It leads to an inability to teach heterogeneous classes, which takes a certain amount of skill And those who are here from Stanford's teacher education program will remember heterogeneous classrooms and complex instruction. But when you don't have that set of tools, tracking tends to follow because teachers can only teach to the average, so to speak. And it leads to a failure to understand students' social, emotional, and academic needs. If you add to that the effects of implicit bias, which are everywhere in the society, you then get also the assumptions that students are incapable, that they're poorly behaved, the assumptions that families don't care, the harsh discriminatory disciplinary treatment, and the activation of stereotype threat, which undermines students' confidence, their growth mindset, and their performance. And that kind of threat is the threat that occurs. It's a form of social identity threat that occurs when the groups that one belongs to are stigmatized in the society. That can be by race, by class, by immigration status, by language background, by disability status, and other various social identities. When a person is experiencing that kind of social identity threat, they then are likely to wonder whether they are going to be perceived through that lens, and may often be perceived and treated through that lens, which then creates a form of toxic stress and anxiety that makes it difficult both to interact in relaxed ways and to open up the mind for learning, which is clouded by high levels of anxiety and toxic stress. So in this COVID moment, all of these things are adding up. And what we see in the newspaper headings are these kinds of headlines that bring these inequalities to life. An old story made new again, why students of color are primed to be left behind, the inequities facing English learners, the COVID slide widening the digital divide for students, learning pods that wealthy parents are creating that create further disparity, the loss of teaching jobs because of the decline in state revenue needed to maintain the teaching force, public education jobs disappearing when they're most needed to meet students' needs, and then the massive cuts that are heading toward the State House in many, many states. As an Oakland student remarked, as we captured it in a document around restarting and reinventing school, I'm concerned about food, jobs, money, my education. Racism towards Asian Pacific Islander folks is a big concern for us too. I miss being around my friends. I'm feeling really, really depressed, but I can't really tell my family. This is what many, many, many students in California and across the country are bringing with them as a sort of a social and emotional weight into their restarting of the school experience this year. And in many places that is happening online rather than in person. This particular little photo went viral. It's two children sitting outside Taco Bell trying to get Wi-Fi so that they can do their schoolwork, a manifestation of the digital divide. So where are we now? This Atlanta parent, really put the point before us. Reprioritize, she said. This is the time to see if something can be different. To reset the system, we have to take a loss, but we can recoup the loss if we actually get kids excited about education and create a more positive space for them to learn. Recall that the system that we currently have for schooling was designed 100 years ago in the 1920s when mass education was beginning to occur, when the assembly lines that had been invented for the creation of manufacturing items, cars, and other things were the design of schools, where the idea was to bureaucratize education and to minimize the ways in which relationships are determinative of what happens in school. In fact, Max Weber, when he was inventing the idea of bureaucracy, noted that bureaucracy is perfected to the extent that it is dehumanized. The idea being that you manage things according to rules and regulations, not with respect to the ways in which individuals idiosyncratically interact with one another. So this is a moment where it is important because everything about education has been disrupted, including the ways in which adults and children come together in schools, the ways in which we think about meeting students' needs, the ways in which we're thinking about education itself. This is a moment for reinventing school as we restart it. So at the Learning Policy Institute, we issued a report that brings together resources and policy and practice proposals that have been put together by many, many groups across the country, civil rights organizations, education organizations, political and policy organizations, to set an agenda for what we need to work on to reinvent school. And much of this is already happening. We point to places where each of these things are being tackled. And that agenda includes these 10 interlocking elements. We have to close the digital divide. When the pandemic occurred, about 30% of young people and families lacked computers that were up to the task, or high-speed internet, or both. Those were, of course, disproportionately families of color and families in low-income communities. In California, we've made a lot of headway by doubling down on how to close the digital divide. We created a Bridging the Digital Divide task force. We've reached out both to corporations and foundations. We've allocated federal money and state money to closing the digital divide. And I would say that we have closed it by more than half in the last 6 months and are likely to largely complete that job this year. So it is a doable task, but people have to get purposeful about doing it. And it's a matter of life and death for a lot of families, in addition to a matter of education, because the same kids who can't get online to see their teachers and to be part of the classroom experience belong to families that can't get online for telehealth, for applying for jobs and benefits, for ordering up Instacart, all the many things that allow for survival and for preserving health in this serious moment. We have to strengthen distance and blended learning, and there's a lot known actually about how to do this kind of learning well. And in fact, there are studies showing that at least for upper elementary age children and older, there are ways in which getting the right kind of relational as well as asynchronous learning, the right kind of interactive tools to support learning, and the right kinds of collaborative work within that setting can actually improve achievement beyond what we sometimes see in individual classrooms. There are places like Long Beach that are taking advantage of this moment to take teachers who are particularly gifted in teaching certain things and open up their classes to everyone. So they've had some classes in which more than 2,000 students have shown up to study with a teacher they've wanted to study with, and other teachers can learn those strategies from the teachers who are skilled in distance and blended learning. It's a moment of inventing and sharing those strategies. We need to assess what students need with a very strong emphasis on social and emotional contexts and situations, as well as what they may need academically. And we need to meet what they need in a way that accelerates their progress on a learning progression, rather than labeling kids above or below, ahead or behind, and putting them in separate classrooms where some kids are tracked into a remedial experience that actually sets them further behind, rather than enabling them to move forward. It's important to remember that everyone is always learning, and we can be strategic about how to accelerate that progress. Obviously, ensuring support for social and emotional learning is front and center on almost every district's agenda, which was not the case before the pandemic. But there's so much more appreciation for what needs to be understood about the situations that staff and students are in, and supported by giving kids the tools to understand their own emotions, to figure out how to get the resources and the relationships in place to enable them to manage those experiences, to wrap around them for securing the resources that they need. We have a moment where schools are being redesigned into smaller cohorts for reasons of not transmitting the virus. And we can build on these new designs to redesign schools for stronger relationships. One of the things we're seeing is that the schools that were already redesigned, such that they had looping of students staying with the same adults from year to year, or advisory systems where there is a group of students and teacher who stay together over multiple years and have a responsibility to one another, that these are places where kids are surviving and succeeding at much higher rates because they have built in the stronger relationships that are needed to address the effects of trauma and also to enable them to be able to figure out how to move forward on their learning. It's a moment where we can begin to emphasize authentic, culturally responsive learning. Interestingly, overnight, we eliminated almost all testing because the testing centers couldn't operate, both for admission to higher education, the UC and the CSU, and about 1,500 colleges around the country put aside the SAT and ACT, and then many decided no longer to continue with it. And K-12 testing has a moratorium, a hiatus at the moment. And it's allowed people to think about what do we want to be focusing on that connects kids to the world beyond. The schools, again, that have had kids involved in inquiry-based projects, culturally and community connected, like the UCLA Community School, where kids were studying COVID in their community in terms of health effects, in terms of tracking the mathematical exponential functions, in terms of the sociological manifestations, in terms of the ways in which expression and language and arts were part of the interpretation and sustaining of the experience. That those kind of schools that really connected learning to the experience of kids had a very energized and strong learning experience for their students. I could give many examples, but I'll just simply note that many states and districts are now putting out resources and guidance that allow for project-based, standards-based and project-based learning and culturally responsive resources for schools that 6 months ago were not on the table. We've got the opportunity to provide expanded learning time as people focus on learning loss. I put that in quotes because ultimately kids are always learning, but they're learning different things at this moment than they might be learning in many cases if they were in traditional school. And so the ways in which successful tutoring programs, successful after school and summer school programs can expand and extend learning time are being considered in ways, again, that they weren't even a few months ago, and potentially funded, and I expect they will be this year, by federal recovery aid. Establishing community schools is critical. Again, the places that had schools where wraparound supports, health, mental health, social service supports were already in place, were able to reach out to families and assist them and enable them to both survive the moment and connect to school. And we need that to be the case, as some states are doing, for all schools, particularly in high poverty communities. And educators are learning how to engage in these practices, and we need to prepare them explicitly for a new design for schools that may shape our next 100 years, rather than restarting schools in the way that they have been before. This includes not only learning how to be engaged in distance and blended learning, but also how to be supportive of the social, emotional, and academic needs of students in culturally responsive and sustaining ways. And finally, even though states are struggling for money, it's a moment where we can leverage more adequate and equitable school funding, as California did when we were broke the last time. The local control funding formula, which is very progressive, was put in place by Jerry Brown when the state had been experiencing budget cuts. And then as new money came back into the system, it came in a more equitable way, which actually turns out to be politically an opportunity for reimagining what we do around investment in education. So this framework is one that is timely, that many people are working on, and where you can find examples all across the country. You can ask the question whether money makes a difference in these eras, and the 30 years in which the achievement gap has been growing were an era in which the argument that money doesn't make a difference was on the table. But economists like Karabo Jackson and Rucker Johnson have done studies of the 40 years of school finance reforms and where low-income students who experienced those reforms with 20% more money spent on them, which is actually not a huge amount. At the time of the study, that would have been somewhere in the vicinity of $1,500 per student more. They had graduation rates 23 points higher, added attainment, higher family incomes, and closing the poverty gap as adults. States that have taken up this charge, like North Carolina, have found that as it was 48th in the country in achievement in 1990 and undertook both those finance reforms and investments in the quality of the teaching profession and the leadership cadre in North Carolina, surpassed the national average within 10 years and was rated about 15th in the country in mathematics, and has sustained those gains over many years, now living on fumes as budgets are being cut again. But the investments really can make a huge difference over time. The same story is true in New Jersey, where after 30 years of litigation, 9 separate court decisions calling for funding equalization. I student taught in Camden, New Jersey, which did spend less than half of what New Brunswick was spending some years ago, where the state commissioner argued that it was not worth putting money into high-need districts because he said urban children, even after years of remediation, will not be able to perform in school as well as their suburban counterparts. We are just being honest, was his claim. But in 1998, they created parity funding. They raised the funds in those high-need districts, which were at that time predominantly Black districts that were in cities, Patterson, Newark, Camden, et cetera. They invested in teacher and leader learning. They put in place high-quality preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds. They focused curriculum and assessments on thinking skills. They required whole reform models that focused on child development. They supported bilingual education. Their achievement grew while the gaps narrowed. This is their first 10 years. And today, that state, which is 53% students of color, is one of the highest achieving in the nation. Second in graduation rate, right behind Iowa, first in 8th grade reading, second in 8th grade reading and math. You can build an anatomy of equity, and that's what we need to be about in the recovery from the pandemic, in which we put in place the supports for children, the equitable school resources, the well-prepared, well-supported educators, a 21st century thinking skills-oriented curriculum and assessment, and ultimately innovative and effective schools. I will say to Dan Schwartz's earlier point that in the campaigns, you will hear that Vice President Biden is talking about some of these things in states other than California, where the swing state vote is going on. And there's a robust education agenda on his website. The costs of inequality and the benefits of equity are huge. As the Excellence in Equity Commission said a few years ago, if Hispanic and African American student performance grew to be comparable to white performance and remained there over the next 80 years, the impact would be staggering, adding some $50 trillion to our economy, more than 3 times the size of our current GDP. This represents the income we forego by not ensuring equity for all of our students, and we see growing attention to this issue all across the country. I'll close with the words of John Dewey, because I think this is what motivates all of us who are in education to do the work that we do. Dewey plagiarized most of what I thought before I thought it. So a good way to close the talk. What the best and wisest parent wants for his or her child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other goal is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Only by being true to the full growth of all the individuals who make it up can society by any chance be true to itself. And that's the agenda that I think we are all in need of pursuing in the coming years. And I think we have a real opportunity to do that with a redesigned system, as well as the investments that will make learning possible for all students.
Thank you, Professor Darling-Hammond. I believe now we are going to transition to the panel discussion with you, Professor Pearman, and Professor Ledesma as well, about policy and school practice and education policy in the COVID world. I don't want to get too much in between what will no doubt be a lively conversation about education policy in these times. So I guess I'll just start off with a very basic question, which is, in addition to all of the contextual elements that were just covered by Professor Darling-Hammond, what are some other factors that we should think about from education policymakers to educators when responding to the difficulties of the pandemic?
Who do you want that?
Oh, there you go.
Maria?
Sure, I'll take a first stab at that. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to join you today. I'm really pleased to be here. I think as Dr. Darling-Hammond laid out just perfectly, it's always a catch-up game between the haves and the have-nots, and it's no different in higher education. In fact, I think the pandemic has only amplified this reality. While the coronavirus has impacted all institutions of higher education, it's those institutions with better endowments that are faring better, or at least are in more stable footing. For instance, if we look at minority serving institutions who are perennially underfunded, they are just going to be struggling in a way that institutions with better endowments are not. The financial precarity that exists for them and for low income, Black, Indigenous, people of color, the BIPOC students is very real. And as far as higher education policy, I think that in a post-COVID environment, we need to think, policymakers in higher education need to think about how they are going to handle admissions. As we just heard, testing just has been put on moratorium for now, but how are we going to handle admissions when, again, we know the playing field is uneven for other reasons. We heard from Dr. Darling-Hammond about the learning pods. And I would also remind us that internally for the faculty, how are we handling their hiring and promotion, especially as we know that this pandemic has hit especially female academics and female academics who are mothers really hard, and has put their careers in many ways on pause.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I actually have a specific question for Dr. Darling-Hammond that I'm hoping she might be able to respond to. I've been thinking a lot about how this pandemic affects, or could potentially affect, the distribution of teacher quality across schools, right? So we know that historically, the most effective teachers generally don't teach in the schools in which there's the most need for great teaching, right? So I'm just curious, Dr. Hammond, as you're kind of thinking through and reimagining schools post-COVID, how can we, or how might we think about ensuring that teacher quality is better distributed across all schools, right? I mean, like what sorts of new opportunities are available for us now relative to in the past to potentially move the needle on that front a bit further?
That's a great question, and thank you. I think one thing is that we have to have a universal supply of great teachers. That is to say, we don't want to just be allocating between and among districts with scarcity. And that means several things. One, we got to make it possible for people to come into teaching without debt. So there should be a policy framework that if you will teach, particularly in high need communities and high need fields, we will pay for your education. And that should be, you know, as we do in medicine, something that is across the board. Some states have done that and have really made a huge dent by bringing talented people in who teach where they are most needed. Secondly, if we want to keep people in the profession after they've been, well, first of all, training them well, we'll keep them longer in the profession. Those who are better prepared stay longer. Those who are better mentored when they come in. So you put in place the mentoring programs that support them so that they are enabled to be effective, because what drives people out, people come into teaching not for the money, but because they want to help kids and they need to be in settings where they can be effective in doing that. So that's a product of their own skill set, and then a collaborative collegial environment where we see that people are able to grow and learn, become more effective. That is actually a big retention factor. And then keeping people in the profession. About 9 out of 10 people hired every year in education, part of the demand, are needed because of the people who left the year before. So our churn rate is very, very high. I've seen a number of states and urban districts and some high need rural districts where they've put in place those features of strong supports on the front end, collegial environments in the schools, where they no longer have shortages because people, you know, have the supports that they need to succeed, and when they're effective, they want to stay. And finally, in places like North Carolina, they also put in place incentives, as California once had, for national board certified teachers who are accomplished teachers, who demonstrate their accomplishment and then get paid 15% more. And in California, we used to have a $20,000 stipend paid out over 4 years for those teachers who would be in high poverty schools. We need to put the incentives in place as well. That having those teachers in the schools allows them to mentor, you know, other teachers and to be part of growing the profession. All these things have been done and are doable. We need, you know, both a federal and a state framework within which those things are pursued all together. The final thing I'll mention is that we have so much evidence about how diversity in the teaching force matters. Particularly, we've got a set of studies about how teachers of color support the achievement and attainment of students of color, and we can invest in minority serving institutions for producing and supporting those teachers into the pipeline as well. Thanks for that softball.
I think I have a question maybe targeted towards Dr. Pearman, but I would love to get everyone's input, obviously, which is, as we know, many disparities in schooling are shaped by segregation, both racial and socioeconomic. And I'm wondering, how do you all anticipate that relationship between disparity and space and segregation being compounded and made worse by the pandemic? And what possible interventions do you see with respect to that?
I'll let my colleagues go.
Yeah, Dave, I think that's a terrific question, David. You know, we've known for a long time that the inequalities that Dr. Darling-Hammond mentioned, that so many of us are quite aware of, is they're spatialized, right? And they're spatialized for a number of reasons. And the point that you brought up is a really good one, and that's the ways in which, you know, when you sort of remove a model of schooling in which children go to a specific space and are required to do schooling virtually, you know, that uncovers or reveals a whole host of other disparities that are also indexed in place. Now, naturally, the one that gets a lot of attention is the digital divide, and the fact that there are particular communities in which access to high quality internet not only that you can, download papers and reports from, but where you can have a stable internet connection. There are all sorts of gaps in terms of that sort of access. But I guess more to your point, I mean, there are all sorts of other new forms of spatial inequality that are emerging in the pandemic. The one that Dr. Darling-Hammond mentioned that I find really intriguing is sort of this emergence of pods, right? Like learning pods that you see in many affluent communities. And really what you have there are these learning centers that are created that are primarily driven by networks, right? So affluent families reach out to their other affluent neighbors and create learning pods in which potentially all sorts of additional learning supports can be created for their students, right? Now those sorts of learning pods are in large part created in ways that aren't there's very little notions of equity or tearing down any sort of walls of inequality. That's not part of those conversations, right? So in the midst of doing schooling in the pandemic, there are all sorts of new spaces that are these new walls, new forms of inequality that are being created as well. So I mean, I'll mention, I just want to mention those as two immediate examples, but certainly want to defer to Maria and Linda Darling-Hammond for other ideas or points that they wanted to mention as well.
Maria, did you want to hop in?
Sure. Yes, I just have a few points that are higher education specific. So I think when I think about your question and how this impact is being affected in terms of a spaced or a spatial way, I think it has the privilege of working from home when we think of higher education. And we know that most instructional staff are very privileged that way. They're also still to this day majority white. And when we think of more of the essential workers, on-campus workers that are in positions such as custodians, food servers, groundskeepers, maintenance, et cetera, they're considered essential workers, but as Dr. Sean Harper has coined it, essential to work, basically. And I think that's a different kind of spatial reality that we also need to think about, because those are also the workers, these essential workers that we're thinking about, the frontline workers who are predominantly, again, people of color, who are most at risk as this pandemic extends to be most fiscally, economically vulnerable, right? And that impacts not just their immediate well-being, but also that of their families. And in some cases, we're talking about individuals who not only support one family, but are multi-households, right, and that they're supporting. So I think when I think of, again, this disparate impact of space, that's another reality that comes to my mind.
Yeah. I want to just give a shout out to the districts. For every place where there is inequality, you have people trying to counteract it. And so districts like San Francisco, which has created learning hubs for 6,000 students using community-based organizations, bringing kids in so that they can do distance learning in a safe place with food, with supports, with adults around, et cetera. Trying to counteract the inequalities that you rightfully noted. Chula Vista, West Contra Costa County are all doing this kind of effort to create these kind of learning hubs. So we need to support every place that the inequalities begin to reopen, the strategies that people are inventing to try to support the kids who need that support. Ultimately, we need federal policy that goes back to where we were before 1981 and puts in place the housing supports, the expectations for affordable housing in all communities. Governor Newsom has actually raised in his very first State of the State address the ways in which we finance the districts to which and develop the schools in high need communities, because if you put great schools in those communities, guess what? More people are going to want to integrate those communities. You make sure that you're not pushing out, but expanding the supply of good schools which attract people. But there's a variety of things that have to be done. Some districts like San Antonio are doing controlled choice plans and making sure that all of the choices that parents make of schools are done in a way that enhances desegregation. And also those things, funding schools adequately and desegregating them go hand in hand. You can't, we wouldn't have gotten to the place where schools were so under-resourced if we hadn't also gotten to the place where we created apartheid schools, right? And that's what the people who launched Brown v. Board of Education understood. The litigation strategy was sometimes a school finance strategy and sometimes a desegregation strategy, but always recognizing that those two things go hand in glove.
Thank you all. So I think we have about a few more minutes left of discussion, and I wanted to ask a higher education focused question to Dr. Ledesma, but as well to Dr. Pearman and Darling-Hammond as well, which is, how do you anticipate the pandemic affecting the first year experiences of underrepresented racial minority students and minority serving institutions in this coming year, and what kinds of potential interventions can be made to support success in higher education?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's tremendously important. And to begin, I will just say that I think that the impact is going to be real, especially for first generation students, right? Because they are going to be the first in their family to enter a post-secondary space. And this is a unique, atypical post-secondary space that even, frankly, even if you have, if you are a continuing generation student, there really is no comparable experience that your, family members or extended friends can share with you about this. So it's going to be kind of learning as we go. But I do think it is important for institutions to really think about how are you going to foster a sense of belonging in a virtual world. As this pandemic continues to extend itself, we know that having students feel at home as though they belong is going to be important. But how do you do that when, again, you are not physically on campus? I think what that's going to mean is, again, more attention to the digital divide that does not cease to become an issue in higher education. It very much continues in higher ed. And it continues also when you have, even when you have good service in terms of internet service, when it's overstressed, right? You may have multiple family members who are either working or going to school from home. So negotiating that. I think also with minority serving institutions, I alluded to earlier that it's still the case that they are disparately underfunded compared to other institutions. So that's one thing to think about. Other areas that I think we need to think about that are maybe tangential, but I would say related to your question is also, how do you rationalize the decisions moving forward by university administrators? For instance, I'm thinking specifically about having the return of high contact sports when we know that this is a virus that is transmitted through contact, and who is put most at risk. And in this case, it tends to be men of color, Black men in particular, student athletes, and they're already a population that we need to be supporting. How do we, have the policymakers or the administrators in higher education understand that sports, while great, this is again a life-death issue that, as was alluded to earlier. I mean, I can go on and on with the types of issues that I think we need to be attuned to, not the least of which is, I think we also need to be mindful of those students who are suffering intersectional kind of challenges. I'm thinking in particular of undocumented students who are going to be facing all of the challenges that we talked about earlier, in addition to this precarious legal limbo with the advent of possible new legal challenges at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I'll just add as well that this too presents universities really a tremendous opportunity to think through new forms of fostering a sense of belonging amongst students first gen students in particular, right? I mean, there are manifold ways in which community can be created now digitally, and what's I think I'm most potentially optimistic about are many of these connections or many of these new sort of networks, infrastructures that can be put in place, can stick with us, well beyond the pandemic when everybody is returned to school. We know that as Dr. Ledesma mentioned, so much of failing, a lack of a sense of belonging creates a whole host of barriers for students to succeed in higher ed, in particular, and we also know that the literature around sort of effective interventions to create a sense of belonging is fairly robust, but a lot of that is not about the digital space, the digital landscape. So I guess I'm just mentioning this as another point of consideration for universities who are dealing with this very issue, to spend a lot of time thinking about this very issue, because for many students, this can really make or break one's experience.
I just wanted to come in at this point and say thank you. Thank you, Linda Darling-Hammond. Thank you, Dr. Maria Ledesma. And thank you, Francis Pearman, for sharing your profound thoughts and knowledge with us today. Thank you also, David, for doing such an excellent job. And now, as day one of the conference draws to a close, I wanted to remind you that the RILE program is committed to bringing an interdisciplinary scholarly focus to the major factors, the major issues that influence educational attainment, especially for historically underserved learners and populations. One of RILE's primary objectives is bringing leadership and attention at the local, national, and international levels. And we focus on training a new generation of scholars and practitioners who can achieve and add to the advancement of knowledge and practice. The RILE faculty thanks you, and we continue to collaborate with other interdisciplinary scholars in conducting research on these very issues. In these troubling times, we are pleased to bring you this world-class conference program. And our desire is to stimulate not only conversation about these critical issues before us, but also to motivate you to move toward groundbreaking research and action that has the power to change the current realities so that post-COVID realities will not be more of the same. Rather, we should move toward more excellence and more equitable education for all. Thank you, Linda, for bringing that to our attention and letting us know that that is happening in some places. There is hope for moving forward. And so now I'd like to encourage each of you to continue this conversation. As we come to the 4 o'clock close for today's program, call up a friend, tell them what you've heard, talk about it, and then join us again tomorrow for installment number 2 towards achieving these goals that we're talking about. Our topic tomorrow will focus on educational abolition. Our speakers will include Dr. Subhani Anamana here at Stanford University, Dr. Jonathan Rosa here at Stanford as well. It will also include Dr. David Stovall from the University of Illinois at Chicago, Dr. Maxine McKinney de Royston from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dr. Carrie Coca from the University of Pittsburgh. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Again, we'll be coming to you at 3 p.m. Pacific time. And so until then, I wish you peace, take good care of yourself and stay safe. And we wish you all the very best from the RILE program. Thank you.